So we learned how to implement prototypal inheritance with constructor functions and then manually setting methods on the constructor function's prototype property. But now it's time to turn our attention to ES6 classes, which essentially allow us to do the exact same thing, but using a nicer and more modern syntax. Now, as I mentioned earlier, classes in JavaScript do not work like traditional classes in other languages like Java or C++. So instead, classes in JavaScript are just synthetic sugar over what we learned in the last few videos. So they still implement prototypal inheritance behind the scenes, but with a syntax that makes more sense to people coming from other programming languages. And so that was basically the goal of adding classes to JavaScript. But anyway, let's now implement person using a class. So we can write class and then the name of the class. And let's actually call it person CL. So that stands for class. And then curly braces like this. And so this is actually a class declaration, but just like in functions, we also have class expressions. And so that would work like this. So class expression and class declaration. And so then you can pick whichever you like the most. So it would be person CL and then class. And then just like a function, but without the arguments. Okay? And that is because, in fact, classes are just a special type of functions. Okay? So although we use the class keyword here, behind the scenes, classes are still functions. And therefore, we have class expressions and class declarations. Now, for some reason, I prefer the class declaration, and so I'm going to use that right here. And so this is how we write a simple class. And then inside the class, the first thing that we need to do is to add a constructor method. So just like this. And this constructor actually works in a pretty similar way as a constructor function. So as we studied previously, but this one is actually a method of this class. And in fact, it needs to be called constructor. So that is the rule. But just like in constructor functions, we pass in arguments basically for the properties that we want the object to have. So that's again first name and then the birth year. Now, the act of creating a new object actually also works in the exact same way as before. So using the new operator. And so therefore, whenever we create a new object, so like a new instance using the new operator, this constructor will automatically be called. So let's actually try that right away. And this time let's create Jessica here. So new person CL. And so as you see, everything here looks exactly the same as before. So it looks just like a regular function call. And again, we also use the new keyword here. And so therefore, just like before, the this keyword here inside of the constructor will also be set to the newly created empty object. And so just like before, we set the properties of the object like this. So this.firstName is equal to first name that we receive, and the same for the birth year. All right. So basically, when we create a new instance here, then it is this constructor that is going to be called, and it will return a new object, and then that will be stored here into Jessica. So let's just log this to the console. And so in fact, it looks just like before. All right. So here we basically have the properties that will be stored in the new object that we want to create. And so now it's time for the methods. And the methods we simply write like this. So we can simply add them here And all we have to do is to write their name. So just like a regular function in here. So this is very nice and very convenient. And so let's simply do the same as before. So this dot birth year. Now, what's important to understand here is that all of these methods that we write in the class, so outside of the constructor, will be on the prototype of the objects and not on the objects themselves. So this is really just like before, prototypal inheritance. And in fact, we will be able to confirm that now. So as we open up person CL here, and in fact, we're going to be able to confirm that here. So as we inspect this Jessica object, when we look into its prototype, then we will once again see the calc_h function here. All right. And so therefore, of course, we're going to be able to do this. And actually, we don't even need to log it to the console because the calc_h method already does that on its own. And so indeed, we get an h here. And so one more time, let me prove to you that Jessica underscore proto underscore underscore is equal to person CL dot prototype. And it is true. And so as you see, person CL here acts just like any other function constructor, with the only difference that this looks a little bit nicer. So with this syntax, we don't have to manually mess with the prototype property. All we have to do is to write the methods here, so inside the class, but outside of the constructor, and then they will automatically be added to the prototype property of the class, basically. So let me actually write that here. So they will be added to the prototype property of the person class, which once again is going to be the prototype of the objects created by that class. And we can take this demonstration even further by also adding a method manually to the prototype. So that's going to work just as fine. So let's create a greet method here. So let's just say, hey, this dot first name, and then we can call this on Jessica. So of course, Jessica dot greet. And so, as you see, that works just as well. All right. And so this is proof one more time that the class really just hides the true nature of prototypal inheritance in JavaScript. So of course, we could now do the same like this. And notice how there are no commas between the methods. Okay, so we could do this, take out this, and it would work the exact same way. You see? So this is great for people who are coming from another language and have experience with object-oriented programming, because it's going to be a bit easier for these developers to start writing object-oriented code in JavaScript. Now, if you're one of these developers, then please make sure that before just starting to use classes, you really truly understand function constructors and the prototype and the whole prototype chain logic. Now, to finish, I just need to say a couple more things about classes that are important to keep in mind. So first, classes are not hoisted. So first, let's scroll a bit here. Classes are not hoisted. And so even if they are class declarations. So function declarations, remember, are hoisted, which means we can use them before they are declared in the code. But with classes, that doesn't work. Second, just like functions, classes are also first-class citizens. First-class citizens. And so what that means is that we can pass them into functions and also return them from functions. And as I mentioned before, that is because classes are really just a special kind of function behind the scenes. And third, the body of a class is always executed in strict mode. Classes are executed in strict mode. And so even if we didn't activate it for our entire script, all the code that is in the class will be executed in strict mode. All right? So keep these points in mind if you want to work with classes. So now at the end of this video, you might ask if you should use constructor functions like we have been doing, or if instead it's better to just use classes. And the first remark I want to do here is that constructor functions are not like old or deprecated syntax. So it's 100% fine to keep using them. So one more time, this is more a question of personal preference. Now, if you're asking if you should use classes without understanding prototypal inheritance, well then the reply is definitely no. Now, some people actually say that classes are really bad in general and that no one should ever be using them simply because they hide the true nature of JavaScript. But I actually don't agree with that, and I think it's absolutely okay to use classes in your code as long as you understand everything that I just showed you previously about the prototype and prototypal inheritance. So you cannot just skip that part, because you want to become an expert in JavaScript, right? And you also want to feel comfortable while writing your code, and that essentially means to understand exactly what your code does. So that's super important too. And so if you want to be confident, you need to understand. And so that's also the whole reason why all over the course I am going into such deep detail into how everything works in JavaScript. Now, what I personally like about classes is that they visually put all the code that belongs to a certain class, so like all the data here and all the behavior, all into one nice code block like this. With function constructors, in my opinion, it all looks just like a big mess. So like this. I mean, in this case, it's just a little bit of code, but this can get out of hand pretty quick. And in these situations, I think that this actually looks at least a lot better. But of course, that is just my personal opinion. What matters is that you start thinking about this yourself and take your own decisions based on what I'm explaining in these videos.